How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Kuf Aleph, Daf 101 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, Daf 101, Sheesh. Daf 101. I think it's going to be a big one. There's it's a very kind of dense daf in some ways. The topic under discussion is hanasheh for non-kosher animals. Machlokes between the Chacham and Rabbi Yehudah. Now, within that context, we explored the opinion of Rabbi Yehudah when it comes to Issur, chal al Issur, trying to decipher what Rabbi Yehudah's opinion is there. And that is really going to be the focus on Kuf Amud Beis, because remember, we still have essentially almost all of Daf Kuf Amud Beis to learn today. After that, we'll briefly have a look at Reb Shimon's shita when it comes to gid hanasheh of non-kosher animals. And finally, we will get into a big discussion about the concept of Issur Kollel. Issur Kollel is a concept that we first were introduced to in Masechta Yevamis, and we are going to have a further exploration of that today. So, a great daf, but another daf that we have to earn. So we will earn it. We will earn it, and earning requires investment, and we are going to make that investment. Friends, come join me. Let's have a great time investing in Daf Kuf Aleph of Masechta Chullin. Friends, we begin. Daf Kuf Amud Beis, 4 lines from the top. At the new Mishnah says the Mishnah, Noeg batehor ve'eno Noeg batmeya, says the Tanakame that gid hanasheh is an Issur that applies to kosher animals. It is not an Issur that applies to non-kosher animals. Rabbi Yehudah Omer says, Rabbi Yehudah af bitmei. Rabbi Yehudah says that gid hanasheh does apply to non-kosher animals. So say one were to eat the gid hanasheh of a hog, they would be chayiv for eating the gid hanasheh. Rabbi Yehudah makes makes the case for his opinion. Rabbi Yehudah makes the argument that after all, gid hanasheh has been a mitzvah all the way back since Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov Avinu predated Matan Torah. At that time, technically speaking, there were no mitzvahs. We had learned recently that where did we learn that on Daf? Come on. Tzadi Aleph Meralf. We had learned in Rashi, Visha b'nei Yaakov shomer mitzvahs sayu. They were shomer mitzvahs. Daf al pishlo nitna Torah. Even the Torah wasn't given mikubal. No, you have a saying that Kabbalah is about mitzvahs. But the fact of the matter is the Torah was not yet given yet. There was no concept of kosher animals and not kosher animals. Sure, they had a Kabbalah, they were makbid, but on a technical sense, there was no concept of kosher and non-kosher, and therefore argues Rabbi Yehudah that since the mitzvah of gid hanasheh is already back to the time of Yaakov Avinu, back to a time when there was no differentiation between a kosher animal, a non-kosher animal. It was an animal, and therefore gid hanasheh applies to all animals, kosher and non-kosher alike. Amrulo, the rabbis responded, however, B'sinai nemar ele shenichtav b'mkomo, a fascinating response. The Chachamim say that we do not agree with that premise. Rather, the gid hanasheh is a mitzvah since Matan Torah, like most of the other mitzvahs. That the mitzvah of gid hanasheh was given to the Yidden at Mount Sinai. Now, when Moshe Rabbeinu was writing the Sefer Torah, and the mitzvah of gid hanasheh was discussed, so he mentioned, the fact of the matter is, why do we have gid hanasheh? Why was the mitzvah of gid hanasheh given to the Yidden at Har Sinai? Well, because when in Yaakov Avinu's lifetime there was that struggle between Yaakov Avinu and the Sarah Shel Esav, and he was the Sarah Shel Esav attacked him in his gid hanasheh. Al kein lo yochlu bnei Yisrael gid hanasheh. That is why when the Torah was given, the Rebbeinu Shalom included a mitzvah, lo saseh, don't eat the gid hanasheh. That was a mitzvah that was given at Har Sinai, like most of the other mitzvahs. But when Moshe Rabbeinu was writing the Torah, he wrote that mitzvah at the place where it's based upon. At the time, he included it by the story, the mitzvah of Gid HaNasheh, he wrote in the place that the event on which it was established because of took place. But the fact of the matter is, argues the Chachamim, we disagree with your analysis, Rabbi Yehudah. We don't say that the Gid HaNasheh has been a mitzvah since the struggle with Yaakov Nesar Shel Esav. The Gid HaNasheh is a mitzvah since Matan Torah, since a time when there in fact was a distinction between kosher and non-kosher, and the Chacham argue therefore the Gid HaNasheh applies only to kosher animals, not to non-kosher animals. I'm going to chap a shluck of coffee and we are going to hit the Gemara. Now, says the Gemara, Frag the Gemara, V'sav Rabbi Yehudah, Issur chal al Issur. You see, the Gemara is asking the following question. Rabbi Yehudah is saying, essentially what the Gemara wants to say, is that if you eat a hog, you're going to be chayiv twice. You're going to be chayiv for eating a non-kosher animal, and additionally you're going to be chayiv for eating the Gid HaNasheh. Now, V'sav Rabbi Yehudah Issur chal al Issur, but does Rabbi Yehudah really hold of this concept that an Issur can be applied, could be added on, can be stacked on another Issur? They can have the Issur of eating non-kosher animal and then stack onto that the Issur of Gid HaNasheh, such that if you eat a Gid HaNasheh of a hog, you'll be chayiv twice. V'atanya, we learn in a brayso, Yehudah Omer says Rabbi Yehudah, this is the sheet of Rabbi Yehudah, as follows. What's this talking about? Tumas ha'of. Tumas nivlas ha'of. The tumah of nivlas ha'of. Now, when it comes to an animal, let's say a sheep, for example, a sheep drops dead, it's a nevela. Nevela is an avatuma. If you touch that sheep, that nevela sheep, that dead sheep, by touching it, you become rishon l'tumah. It's mitami b'negia. It's mitami b'maga. That is not the case by birds. You know, I went to chicken shechita the other week. One of the birds, one of the chickens, it was a posel shechita. That chicken was a nevela. Nobody became tameh that night, at least not because of that. Everyone's tameh anyways. But tameh mace, whatever. But nobody was tameh for having touched that chicken. When it comes to a bird, a dead bird, a nevela bird, it's not mitame b'mago. How is it mitame? It's mitame b'beis habliya. If you eat that bird, when you swallow that bite, when you eat that bite of a bird, when you eat that bird, you exercise of it. I believe it's exercise. That is when you become tummy. It's mitame begodim. You become tummy. Your clothing becomes tummy. When you eat it, you become tummy. Now, says Rabbi Yehudah, Yachol, is it possible to nivlas of tameh mitame begodim v'beis habliya? What about a pelican? What if you eat a pelican? So a pelican is a bird. If you have a nevela of a pelican, if you touch it, you won't become tummy. What if you eat a pelican? Will you become tummy then? Talmud, the pasuk says, nevela utrefa lo yochal l'tamaba. So from the fact that the pasuk says lo yochal l'tamaba, don't become tummy via eating, we're clearly talking about the nevela of a bird. The Ramban al Torah as a mahalach, but Pashtus is not Pashtus. The drasha's Chazal is from the fact that the pasuk says lo yochal l'tama, don't become tummy through eating. We're talking about the nevela of a bird, which is mitame b'beis habliya. The question is, sure, that applies to kosher birds. What about non-kosher birds? So the Gemara, so the drasha is medayik from the fact that it says nevela. Utrefa, don't worry about treifa right now. We'll focus on nevela. Nevela lo yochal l'tama ba. Misha isuro mishum batochal nevela. That what kinds of birds are metame begadim abeis abliya? Birds, kosher birds. Birds that when they're a nevela are only a nevela. I'm sorry. Birds that are a nevela. Yotza zeh she'ein isuro mishum batochal nevela ela mishum batochal tmeya. You hear what just happened? That pasuk, when it talks about yochal tamaba, about tumas begadim besabliya, it says nevela essentially lo yochal the tamaba. That the tuma bebeis abliya, the tuma via eating it, applies to birds that their tuma is because they're nevela, kosher birds, like the chicken at the chicken shchita. A chicken, if it's nevela, if you eat it, you're going to become tameh because that chicken is nevela. Now, if we're talking about a pelican, says Rabbi Yehudah, it isn't. The issue is not nevela. The issue is that it's not kosher. Rabbi Yehudah says that if you eat a pelican, you won't become tameh because the issue with the pelican is not that it's nevela. The issue with the pelican is that it's not kosher. It's tameh. Now, why can't you say that it's not kosher and it's nevela? Well, because Rabbi Yehudah says, "Ein Issur chalal Issur." Because Yehudah says that you're not going to, the pelican from the time that it was born, it was not kosher. It only became a nevela when it died. And the status of nevela won't be stacked on to it not being kosher. It's only not kosher, we won't consider it as an issue of being nevela as well. So we see that Rabbi Yehudah is saying that you won't stack one Issur onto another. Ein Issur chalal Issur. That's what we see from this brisa. From the fact that we're considering the pelican to be not kosher, and we're not saying anything about it also being an nevela, Ein Issur chalal Issur. So if that's the case, that's Shitas Rabbi Yehudah, that Ein Issur chalal Issur, then how do we understand his opinion when it comes to gid hanasheh? After all, he's saying that gid hanasheh, the Issur, the losaisa of gid hanasheh applies even to animals that are not kosher, where you'll be chayiv for not kosher and gid hanasheh. But this seems inconsistent. In one place he's saying ein Issur chalal Issur, and yet he's saying that you're chayiv for gid hanasheh and non-kosher. What do you think? If you're going to tell me, I may have skipped, right? So Yotze zeh she'ein Issur mishum batochal nevela ela mishum batochal tmeya. Fine. If you're going to tell me, maybe you'll suggest the following: that Rabbi Yehudah holds ein begidim b'nosein tam. We learned the other day, it's a machlokes. Do gidim, do sinews impart flavor or not? The gid hanasheh being a gid, being a sinew. So maybe Rabbi Yehudah holds ein begidim b'nosein tam. Sinews don't impart flavor. And when you eat the gid hanasheh, the sinew, the sciatic nerve of a hog, you're not getting any of the flavor, any of the tam of the meat. You're just eating this tasteless nerve, and you won't be chayiv for eating a hog, for eating non-kosher animals. You won't be chayiv because ein begidim b'nosein tam. But you are eating the gid hanasheh, and you will be chayiv for that. Maybe that's Shitas Rabbi Yehudah. That when he says that you're chayiv for the gid hanasheh of a non-kosher animal, it means that if you eat the gid hanasheh of a non-kosher animal, you're chayiv only for having eaten the gid hanasheh, not for having eaten a non-kosher animal. And therefore, when you eat a hog, Issur gid ika, Issur tuma leka, you'd only be chayiv for eating the gid hanasheh, you would not be chayiv for eating non-kosher. But that can't be, because v'savar Rabbi Yehudah ein begidim b'nosein tam. Is that really so? The Rabbi Yehudah holds ein begidim b'nosein tam. V'otani, we learn in the brisa oichel gid hanasheh shabei mitmeh. If a person eats the gid hanasheh of a non-kosher animal, of a hog, Rabbi Yehudah mechayiv shtayim. Rabbi Yehudah says you chayiv twice for eating non-kosher and for eating gid hanasheh. So it seems that Rabbi Yehudah is really digging in over here. He's saying that you're chayiv for eating the gid hanasheh of a non-kosher animal, and you'll be chayiv twice for eating non-kosher animal and for eating gid hanasheh. Now, we really have our work cut out for us, because on the one hand, we saw that Shitas Rabbi Yehudah is, when it came to nivlas of tameh, ein Issur chal al Issur. So it seems that on the one hand, Rabbi Yehudah holds ein Issur chal al Issur. On the other hand, he's saying that by eating the gid hanasheh of a behemoth tameh, you're chayiv twice, Issur chal al Issur. Which one is it? Reb Shimon Poter, interestingly, Reb Shimon's shita is that if you eat the gid hanasheh of a behemoth tameh, you're not chayiv for anything. You're not chayiv for non-kosher animals. You're not chayiv for gid hanasheh. We're gonna explain his shita at the top of Kuf Aleph Amud Aleph. And then we have another shtuk of coffee. We'll go weiter. A little cliffhanger for a second. The olam kasavar yesh begidim b'nosin tam. And for the Gemara, okay, clearly Rabbi Yehudah holds yesh begidim b'nosin tam, which is why he's saying that you'd be chayiv for eating a non-kosher animal when you eat its gid hanasheh. Yesh begidim b'nosin tam. V'katsovar noyeg b'shlil. Okay, the Gemara wants to suggest that gid hanasheh applies to a fetus. Now, you might be wondering, and as the Gemara is going to ask in just a minute, that on the first Mishnah, in the first Mishnah of our great Perek, the Mishnah had said that gid hanasheh applies to a fetus. Rabbi Yehudah says it doesn't apply to a fetus. The Gemara is going to ask that in just a moment. But for now, the Gemara suggests that maybe Rabbi Yehudah says that gid hanasheh applies to fetuses. And that being the case, the Issur of the animal as a non-kosher animal and the Issur of the gid hanasheh were developing concurrently. That this is not Issur chal al Issur. Issur chal al Issur means that a later Issur came. So for example, if you have a non-kosher animal and then it becomes a nevela, well, it was first a non-kosher animal, and then later on we're tacking on the nevela when it dies. But if we say that gid hanasheh already applies from the time that it's a fetus and growing and developing into an animal, if we say that the gid hanasheh already applies to the fetus, well then as the animal is developing into a non-kosher animal, it is also developing its gid hanasheh at the same time, and those two Issurs are developing concurrently. Concurrency. I always have to keep reminding myself of that word. I insist on using it, yet it's like not at the top of my brain. Concurrent. Oh boy. Concurrency, right? That's when things happen at the same time. As far as this daf is concerned, concurrent means two things happening at the same time. I think that's the word I'm looking for. Al kopanim. So both Issurim are developing concurrently, and therefore you're going to be chayiv for both of them. It's not actually Issur chal al Issur, and that is why Rabbi Yehudah can say that when you eat the gid hanasheh of a behemoth tameh, you're chayiv for both, since both Issurim were developing concurrently. And it's not consecutive. It is concurrent, it's not consecutive. Okay. The Issur gid, v'Issur tuma, ba'de adadi ka'aseh, that the Issur of the gid hanasheh and the Issur of it being a non-kosher animal developed into Issurim concurrently. Umimatzis amrat noig b'shlil, but can you in fact argue that Rabbi Yehudah says that the gid hanasheh applies to a fetus? What about the first Mishnah in our Perek? Noig b'shlil, according to Tanakama, gid hanasheh applies to a fetus. Rabbi Yehudah, Omer eino noig b'shlil. Skip the next two words. Rabbi Yehudah says, gid hanasheh doesn't apply to fetus. So Rabbi Yehudah's shita apparently is that gid hanasheh does not apply to fetuses. So there goes the whole concurrency thing. And for the Gemara, Hanimi legabi Torah. When Rabbi Yehudah had said in the first mission of our Perek that gid hanasheh does not apply to a fetus, what he's saying is gid hanasheh does not apply to the fetus of a kosher animal. Let's go weiter. Because the Torah says, as we learned in Perik Be'ema Makasha Leiled, what a gewaldige Perik. Right? As we learned in the great Perik of Be'ema Makasha, if you shecht an animal and you find inside the animal a fetus, you can eat the fetus. Because the Pasuk says, Kol ba'be'ema tochelu, anything inside the animal, you can eat. You shecht an animal, if there's a fetus inside, you can eat that. Guess what else you can eat? If there's a fetus with a gid hanasheh, right? There's a fetus inside, you can eat it, and it's gid hanasheh. Anything that you find inside the animal is kosher, you can eat it. The animal's kosher, the gid hanasheh is kosher, argues, right? The fetus is kosher, its gid hanasheh is kosher, you can eat it, argues Rabbi Yehudah. But that's by a kosher animal. Kilu, that's based on the fact of kol ba'be'ema tochelu. In a scenario where you shech the mother and you can eat the mother and you can eat the fetus, you can also eat the gid hanasheh. That, however, would not apply to a non-kosher animal. And therefore, when Rabbi Yehudah says that there's no din of gid hanasheh by a fetus, that's by a kosher fetus. By a non-kosher animal where you're not allowed to eat it, there would be gid hanasheh even by the fetus, and therefore the non-kosher, right, the development of this hog, let's say, as a non-kosher animal, is developing concurrently with its gid hanasheh. When we're talking about a non-kosher animal, noyeg, there would be gid hanasheh by the fetus. However, we are not done with our analysis, and we are going to ask a question like we asked at the beginning of the Perik. From the same Mishnah, Masechta Nazir, Mimatzis, Omrat, Titavai Ba'de Adadi Kasu, can you really say that this non-kosher fetus developed as a non-kosher animal concurrently with it developing its gid hanasheh? You can't say that, as we couldn't say it at the beginning of the parak either. Ve'atnan, based on the Mishnah Masechta Nazir, al elu tumis hanazir migalech. Of course, a nazir, if he becomes tameh in the course of being a nazir, he's got to start all over again. If he becomes tameh tumas hameis as a nazir, he's got to start all over again. And we say al hameis, that's if he becomes tameh from a corpse, val kazayis min hameis, or even just a kazayis, an olive's worth from a mace. In either scenario, he would have to start all over again. He's got to shave his head, bring some korbanos, he's got to start all over again. V'kashalan, and we ask, al kazayis min hameis megalech, al hameis kulo lo kol shekain. I don't understand. The Mishnah there, Masechta Nazir, says that if that for a olive's worth from a corpse, if he becomes tameh from that, he would have to start all over again. Certainly, if an entire corpse contaminated him, he'd have to start all over again. Why do I need both the whole corpse and the kazayis? The kazayis should be enough. And if he's start over from kazayis, obviously from the whole thing, from the whole corpse as well. Rabbi Yechon says that whole corpse, you know what it's talking about? When there is no kazayis of meat in the whole corpse, how could there not be a kazayis of meat in the whole corpse? Lo nitzrucha ela l'neifel. If you have a fetus that is in early stages of development, and it's got its limbs, shelo niskasher evar begidin, that it's got its limbs there, but it doesn't yet have its gidim yet, it doesn't yet have its sinews. And it would be considered a mace to be metame the nazir, and we have tumas a mace to be metame the nazir, because it's got all of its limbs, and it doesn't yet have a kazayis of flesh there yet, but it's got its limbs, does not yet have a kazayis of flesh, does not yet have its gidim. but it could already be metame. Alma, so we see tuma kodim, that the tuma precedes the gidim. And therefore it's inaccurate to say that the non-kosher animal develops together with its gid hanasheh. The gid hanasheh comes later. Comes at a later stage of development. So we're back to our question. How could it be that Rabbi Yehudah, on the one hand, says, Ein Issur chal al Issur, gid hanasheh cannot be stacked onto the Issur of eating non-kosher. Yet, at the same time, he says that if you eat the gid hanasheh of a non-kosher animal, you are chayiv for both things. So, and for the Gemara, af al gav, the Issur, I hope I didn't skip, right? So, Amal Issur Tuma Kodim, af al gav, the Issur Tuma Kodim, as the Issur Gid Chayil Ole. However, says the Gemara, in this case, even though the fact that it is a non-kosher animal came first, and the Issur of eating non-kosher came first, in this case of gid hanasheh, the gid hanasheh will be stacked on, and you'll be chayiv for both. Sheken isuru noyeg b'vnei noyach, because the gid hanasheh is a very stringent thing, so stringent that it even predates Matan Torah, and it goes back to the b'nei noyach. And for that reason, because we're talking about such a stringent avera, it even can be added to another avera. And therefore, even though the avera of eating non-kosher preceded the avera of gid hanasheh, because gid hanasheh is so stringent in that it even applies to b'nei noyach, it predates Matan Torah according to Rabbi Yehudah, we will say Issur chal al Issur. Daikanami, you can also infer this dikatoni that it says in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehudah v'alom mibnei yankiv nesar gid hanasheh v'adayin beima tmeya mutar yisrael. Rabbi Yehudah didn't simply say that gid hanasheh is a mitzvah that it applies to kosher and non-kosher. He made a point of saying that it's Bnei Yaakov, that it predates the Torah, it's already from the Bnei Noach. He makes a point of pointing that out, and not just saying that the gid hanasheh applies to kosher animals and non-kosher animals. He makes a point of saying that it's already applies to the Bnei Noach, from which we want to infer that what Rabbi Yehudah is saying, and the reason why Rabbi Yehudah says they'd be chayiv twice for eating the gid hanasheh of a non-kosher animal, even though generally he would say Ein Issur chal al Issur, as we saw by Nivlas of Tameh, over here he would say Issur chal al Issur because of the stringency of gid hanasheh, in that it even predates Matan Torah and is shaykh to the Bnei Noach, back to the Bnei Yaakov, at a time that predates Matan Torah, and that's how stringent it is, and therefore it can be added on top of the Issur of non-kosher. Givaldig. So that was kind of a deep exploration of Rabbi Yehudah's shita, that gid hanasheh applies even to non-kosher animals, and you'll be chayiv twice for eating the gid hanasheh of a non-kosher animal, for eating non-kosher as well as for eating gid hanasheh. Now we are briefly going to revisit the shita of Reb Shimon, who we saw a few moments ago, who says that if one were to eat the sciatic nerve of a non-kosher animal, he would be chayiv for nothing. Why is that? One who eats the sciatic nerve of a non-kosher animal, Rabbi Yehudah mechayiv shtayim. Rabbi Yehudah, as we just delved into to understand, and now we understand that according to Rabbi Yehudah, why according to Rabbi Yehudah, you would be chayiv twice for eating non-kosher and for eating the gid hanasheh. Reb Shimon poter. Reb Shimon, however, says you are chayiv for zilch. Reb Shimon, that's Reb Shimon. Reb Shimon man avshoch. I don't understand Reb Shimon. I Issur chal al Issur. If he holds Issur, Kollel, Issur, well then you should be chayiv twice, like Rabbi Yehudah, non-kosher and gid hanasheh. The chayiv nami mishum gid, chayiv for non-kosher and for gid hanasheh. I ein Issur, Kollel, Issur, and if you say, well, ein Issur, Kollel, Issur, well, at least be chayiv for non-kosher. The chayiv mishum tuma, dikodim, because as we've discussed, the Issur, the fact that it's a tummy animal, a non-kosher animal, preceded the gid hanasheh, so at least be chayiv for eating a non-kosher animal. And if you're going to say, well, gidim, like the gid hanasheh, have no flavor, and you wouldn't be chayiv for eating a non-kosher animal, but at least the chayiv mishum gid, okay? So if you're not chayiv for eating non-kosher, well then be chayiv for eating the gid hanasheh. On my Rava, says Rava, here's the thing. The olam kosav ein begid b'nosin tam. Rabbi Shimon holds that there is no flavor in gidim, and therefore you are not chayiv for eating non-kosher if all you ate was the gid hanasheh. It's a gid, it has no flavor, you're not chayiv for eating non-kosher. V'shain yasim de omar kro al kein lo yochlu b'nei Yisrael's gid hanasheh, and additionally, you wouldn't be chayiv for eating the gid hanasheh either, because by the gid hanasheh, the pasuk says, al kein lo yochlu b'nei Yisrael gid hanasheh, mi shegido asur uv'saro mutter. We're talking about a scenario where the issue is with eating the gid hanasheh, but there's no issue with eating the rest of the meat. A sheep, for example, you can eat all the meat of the sheep, just don't eat the gid hanasheh. Lo yochlu b'nei Yisrael is gid hanasheh. Specifically, don't eat the gid hanasheh. You can enjoy the rest of the meat. Yatzis hazo shegido asur uv'saro asur. To the exclusion of, for example, a hog, where you can't eat the gid hanasheh, nor can you eat any of the meat. Gid hanasheh does not apply to a hog. And therefore, if all one eats from the hog is the gid hanasheh, according to Reb Shimon, you would not be chayiv for eating non-kosher, because there's no flavor in that gid hanasheh. Ein begid b'nosin tam. And additionally, the gid hanasheh does not apply to non-kosher animals. And therefore, you wouldn't be chayiv for eating the gid hanasheh either. You would be chayiv for nothing. And now we learn about the topic of Issur Kollel. It's an interesting topic, in my opinion. It's also a complex one. It's a what's the right word? I don't know if complex is the right word, but it's complex. Okay. Says the Gemara, Amar Yehudah, Amar Rav, Ha'oichel gid hanasheh shel nevela. One who eats the gid hanasheh of nevela. Okay. So now this is a scenario where you have, let's say, a sheep. Now the sheep, when it was alive, had a gid hanasheh. So that gid hanasheh was already going to be asur from the time that it's alive. Kilu, obviously all the rest of the meat is also asur as long as it's alive. It's Avram and Achai. But the point is, all along, there was this gid hanasheh, and no matter what, you're not going to be able to eat it. Then it drops dead, and it becomes nevela. So the Issur of gid hanasheh, its gid hanasheh preceded the fact that it's nevela. Rav Meir Mechayev Shtayim, Rav Meir says, nonetheless, you are chayev twice. You're going to be chayev for the gid hanasheh, and you're going to be chayev for the nevela. Okay, seems that I guess Rav Meir does not have an issue with Issur Halal Issur. Okay, fine. Unless maybe you could make other arguments. Anyways, the Chacham say Eino chayev ela achas. The Chacham say that you're only chayev for the gid hanasheh. You're not going to be chayev for nevela. Umodim Chacham the Rav Meir. However, the Chachamim agree with Rav Meir. Be'ochel gid hanasheh shel ola v'shel shora niskal shechayev shtein. However, the Chachamim would agree with Rav Meir if one ate the gid hanasheh of a korban ola. If one goes over to a sheep and says, you're going to be a korban ola, and now it's a korban ola, so it's asur bano, right? It's me'ila. You're not allowed to get benefit from it. You're not allowed to eat it. And we're saying that if you were to eat the gid hanasheh of a korban ola, you would be chayiv twice for eating the gid hanasheh and for eating a korban ola that you're not allowed to get benefit from. And similarly, a shor and iskal, an ox, has a gid hanasheh. You're not allowed to eat that gid hanasheh. If subsequently that ox gored a person and killed a person, and now you have to stone it to death, you're not allowed to get any benefit from it. It's also bano. If you eat the gid hanasheh of that ox, you can be chayiv twice for eating the gid hanasheh and for getting benefit from something that is also bano, from the shor and iskal. So we see that according to the Chachamim, they are making a distinction between nevela, where they say if you eat the gid hanasheh of a nevela, you chayiv once, on the one hand, and korban ola / shor and iskal on the other hand, where they say if you eat the gid hanasheh from them, you'll be chayiv twice. The question is why? Uman haitana, who would the Chachamim be? Who is the Tana who holds the Issur Kollel? Then it comes in Issur Kollel, because all three of these examples are in Issur Kollel, and I'll explain what that means in a second. Nevela, Ola, Shor and Iskal, those are all examples of Issur Kollel, which I will explain what that means in a minute. Issur chal al Issur leisle. And when it comes to Issur Kollel, the Chacham would say, Ein Issur chal al Issur. Therefore, when it came to Nevela, which is an Issur Kollel, which once again I will explain what that is shortly. When it comes to Nevela, which is an Issur Kollel, they say Ein Issur chal al Issur, and you only chayiv for the gid hanasheh, you're not chayiv for Nevela. Issur Kollel be'Issur Chomer Isle. However, when it comes to an Issur Kollel that's more stringent, like korban ola, like shor and iskal, then they do say Issur chal al Issur, and you're going to be chayiv twice. What's an Issur Kollel? This is a concept that I think my first recollection, my first memory of it at Babble on Talmud is Masechta Yevamis. I can't tell you exactly what the specific context was, but when I was learning this, I was like, wait a second, Masechta Yevamis. I'm going to leave it at that. I'm not going to try to get into Masechta Yevamis right now. I don't think that it serves us. We got enough on our plate. Nothing insane here, but we have to be methodical here. We're going to focus on the sugya at hand. What an Issur Kollel is that, let's start with Nevela. So you have a sheep, and that sheep has a gid hanasheh. You're not allowed to eat the gid hanasheh of that sheep. Potentially, if you do a kosher shechita on the sheep, you can eat all the rest of the meat. You can't eat that gid hanasheh, that's for sure. That sheep drops dead. So now what happens is, the entire animal, including the gid hanasheh, the entire animal is not allowed to be eaten. Added on to the gid hanasheh, which you were all along not allowed to eat, now it's a nevela. There's now the Issur of nevela. And that Issur of nevela applies to the entire animal, all of the meat, as well as the gid hanasheh as well. And the question is, does nevela apply to the gid hanasheh as well? Meaning, obviously, the gid hanasheh, you'll be chayiv for eating the gid hanasheh. But will you also now be chayiv by eating this gid hanasheh additionally for nevela? What's the argument to say, yes, you'd be chayiv twice, that Issur chal al Issur? The argument would be to say that this is an Issur Kollel. So for example, unlike, we talked about earlier in the daf, the gid hanasheh of a non-kosher animal. So we said that the gid hanasheh, so you have a non-kosher animal, okay, that's one Issur. And then you have the gid hanasheh, which is an additional Issur. But those are kind of two Issurim that apply to a non-kosher animal. But the second Issur, gid hanasheh, doesn't include the non-kosher animal per se, as opposed to the Issur of nevela, don't eat nevela, applies to the entirety of the animal, including the gid hanasheh. So even though the gid hanasheh was already usher from beforehand, we could make the argument that when this animal becomes nevela and becomes usher in its entirety, and you can't eat any of the meat, let's say that migo, just like you can't eat any of the other meat, and just like nevela applies to all the rest of the meat, let's say that it also applies to the gid hanasheh, which was already usher from beforehand. But let's say that now this additional Issur of nevela, just like it applies now to the rest of the meat, it also applies to the gid hanasheh. And therefore, if you eat the gid hanasheh, not only are you chayiv for the gid hanasheh, but you're also chayiv now for this Issur Kollel, this inclusive Issur of nevela, which applies to the entire animal, including the gid hanasheh, that just like it applies to all the rest of the meat, it should apply also to the gid hanasheh. Now, the Chachamim say no. I mean, the Chachamim say, I get it, but no. That ein Issur chal Issur by an Issur Kollel. Yes, it's correct that nevela is an Issur Kollel. We still will not say Issur chal Issur. And yes, it's true that nevela will apply to all the meat. It won't apply to the gid hanasheh. However, when it comes to korban ola, when it comes to shor haniskal, which is also an Issur Kollel, right before, right, a korban ola, a shor haniskal, it also had a gid hanasheh all along, right? You have a sheep. The sheep has a gid hanasheh from the time that it's born. You then are makdish this sheep as a korban ola. Now the Issur anah, you can't get benefit from korban ola. It's me'ilah. The Issur anah of a korban ola now applies to the entirety of the animal, not just the gid hanasheh, to all of the meat, including the gid hanasheh. So it's an Issur Kollel. But it's more than just an Issur Kollel. It also is more stringent. It's more chamor. It adds a new element that didn't exist beforehand. Initially, you were not allowed to eat the gid hanasheh. Now that it's a korban ola, not only can't you eat it, you can't get any benefit. It's also ba'anoah. You can't get any benefit. You can't sell it. You can't get any benefit from the gid hanasheh. Initially, it was just also ba'achila. Now that it's a korban ola, not only is it also ba'achila, it's also also ba'anoah. Same thing by a shor haniskal, which is also ba'anoah. So therefore, what do we see? We saw that the opinion of the Chachamim is that by stam and Issur Kollel, they say ein Issur Kollel Issur. Therefore, the gid hanasheh of a nevela, you'll be chayiv for eating gid hanasheh, but not for eating nevela. You're chayiv once. But when it comes to korban ola, when it comes to shor haniskal, where it's an Issur Kollel that also ups the ante, that also makes it also ba'anoah, that's more stringent, they will say Issur chal Issur. And yes, you'll be chayiv for the gid hanasheh and for getting benefit from a korban ola. You'll be chayiv for gid hanasheh and for getting benefit from a shor haniskal. So they say, so again, so it's written inside, where Uman Hai Tana, who is this Tana who says, who is the Chachamim? The Issur Kollel, that when it comes to an Issur Kollel, Issur Chal Issur Leislei, we don't hold of Issur Chal Issur, and therefore by nevela, you're only chayiv for gid hanasheh, not nevela. However, Issur Kollel, Issur Chomer, but if we're talking about an Issur Kollel that ups the ante, like Ola, like shor haniskal, Islay, we will say Issur Chal Issur, and you'll be chayiv twice, as we saw is the opinion of the Chacham in that brisa. Amar Rava says, Rava, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, that would be the opinion of Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says, Ein Issur Chal Issur by Issur Kollel, but if it's more chamor, he would say Issur Kollel Issur. The Tananis we learned in the Mishnah in Masechta Zvachim, the second Mishnah of the 13th parak of Masechta Zvachim. Tomei she'achal kodesh, a tomei person who eats kodesh, that's a chiyuv kares, and b'shogeg yichayev a korban chatas. Bein kodesh tomei, bein kodesh tar, whether that kodesh, let's say it's talking about the meat of a korban shlamim, whether that meat of a korban shlamim was tahor, tamei, no difference. Chayev, he has to bring a korban chatas. That's assuming that it was b'shogeg. Rabbi Yosef Glili Omer, says Rabbi Yosef Glili, Tomei she'ochal es hator chayev, that a tamei person who eats tahor kodesh is chayev to bring a korban chatas. Tomei she'ochal es hatamei potter. But a tamei person who eats tamei kodesh is not chayiv to bring a korban chatas. How come? Shlo achal ela dvar tamei. Because since the meat was tamei, we treat it as somebody who eats tamei meat, which is a lav. The pasuk says that. Do I have the pasuk over here? Yes. The pasuk says, I'm going to read you the pasuk. V'abasa asher yiga b'chol tamei lo ye'achel. The pasuk says that any b'sar kodesh that becomes tamei, you can't eat it. Any b'sar kodesh that becomes tamei, you can't eat it. It's a lab. If you eat it, you chayiv makis. So it says Rabbi Yosef Glili that a tamei person who eats tahor kodesh is chayiv to be a korban chatas. Again, we're talking about b'shogeg, and that's the last time I'm going to say that. So we're talking about b'shogeg, and therefore we're talking about korban chatas. So a tamei person who eats tahor kodesh is chayiv to be a korban chatas, but a tamei person who eats tamei kodesh is not chayiv a korban chatas, because we treat it as though he's a person who's eating tamei kodesh, and a person, or a person who eats tamei kodesh, it's a lav, it's not kares, and therefore there's no chatas b'shogeg. So we're going to treat it the same way that we treat a Torah person who eats tamei. Now, Amrulo, the Chacham said to Rabbi Yosef Glili, I don't understand your argument. Rabbi Yosef Glili, you said that a tamei person who eats tahor kodesh is chayiv to be a korban chatas. A tamei person who eats tamei kodesh doesn't bring a korban chatas. But here's the thing, say the rabbis. Av tamei she'achal es tahor. You see, when a tamei person picks up some tahor kodesh to take a bite out of it, kevin shenoga bo tam'o. Once he touches it to pick it up and bring it to his mouth, he's already made it tamei anyways. So I don't understand, Rabbi Yosef Glili. You're saying that a tamei person who eats tahor kodesh is chayiv chatas, but if he eats tamei kodesh, he's not. But the fact of the matter is, when he picks up the tahor kodesh to eat it, he's going to be mitamei it. So there really isn't a distinction between tahor and tamei in that sense. So why are you making that distinction? If you say that he's not chayiv chatas for eating tamei kodesh, well, the fact of the matter is the tahor kodesh is going to be tamei by the time he eats it because he's picking it up. Shapir Kamer le Rabbanan Rabbi Yosef Glili, the Gemara points out that that's a valid challenge. V'amar Rava, and Rava explains the machlokes for us. V'nitma aguf v'achar kach nitma basar kuli alma lo plige dechayiv d'Issur kares kodim. Rava explains for us that, of course, Rabbi Yosef Glili would say that his opinion is that a tamei person who eats kodesh, of course, is chayiv kares. We know that from Masechta Shavuos, that Tamei Shachal Es HaKodesh. The truth is that he's chayav a korban olav yored. He's chayav a korban olav yored, of course. Tumas mikdash v'kadoshim. That a tamei person who eats kodesh, he's chayav kares. By accident, he brings a korban olav yored, right? Depending on what he can afford. So it says Rabbi Yosef Galili, yeah, of course, 100%. A tamei person who eats kodesh by accident, he's got to bring a korban olav yored, regardless of if the kodesh was tahor, or even if the kodesh was tamei. If he was tamei before the kodesh was, well then, from the time that he becomes tamei, there is an Issur kares when he eats that kodesh, and even if it subsequently becomes tamei, it makes no difference. That Issur kares remains. And korban olav v'yored b'shogeg. Ki plige, where the machlokes between Rabbi Yossi Aglili and the Chachamim is the other way around. If you had meat, if you had kodesh, b'sar shlomim, for example, that was already tamei, and now he becomes tamei. So when the meat was tamei and he was tahor, that was a lav. When he now becomes tamei, it ups the ante, and it's now kares. Now the question is, forget about upping the ante. We'll get back to that later. This is an Issur Kollel. When he becomes tamei, it's an Issur Kollel. Why is it an Issur Kollel? Because when it was just the meat that was tamei, so he couldn't eat that particular meat. When he becomes tamei, he can't eat any of the kosher meat, even Torah kosher meat. So it's an Issur Kollel. When he becomes tamei, he can't eat any kosher, including this tamei meat. So what does the Gemara say? So kiplige ben nitma basar, where the meat was already tamei, ve'achar kach nitma guf, and then he becomes tamei. Rabbanan islu Issur Kollel. The rabbis hold of an Issur Kollel, that when he becomes tamei, he's not allowed to eat any b'sar kachim, tamei, tar, anything. That since now that he's tamei, he would be chayiv even for tahor meat, for tahor kodesh, de alma. Mechayiv nami achaticha tmeis, he's also going to be chayiv for this tamei meat as well. And therefore, the Chachamim say that while initially he would have been only over on a lab for eating this tamei meat, now that he himself is tamei, and now it becomes osur and for him to eat all kodesh meat, even Torah kodesh meat, and certainly including this tamei kodesh meat. So they say he is going to be chayiv kares for eating this tamei meat, and by accident korban olav yored. Rabbi Yossi leislei Issur Kollel. However, Rabbi Yossi Aglili does not hold that way, does not hold that the Issur Kollel will make him chayiv. Temigo lo aminon, he doesn't say that since he's now not allowed to eat the other meat, he's also not allowed to eat this tamei meat because he's, chiyuv kares, whatever. But now, frag the Gemara, but still, we had said earlier, we're saying that Rabbi Yossi Aglili we're trying to make the argument that Rabbi Yossi Aglili is the one who says that by Issur Kollel, he does not say Issur Kollel Issur, but if it's Issur Kollel that's more stringent, like we saw earlier by the Korban Olah, by the Shor HaNiskal, the Chacham said that you would say Issur Kollel Issur, and we're saying that that's the opinion of Rabbi Yossi Aglili. So here, didn't we up the ante when he becomes tamei? Before it was in lav, now it's a chiyuv kares. So shouldn't Rabbi Yossi Aglili say that there would be Issur Kollel Issur by an Issur Kollel that's more chamor? Rabbi Yossi Aglili, nihid Issur Kollel leisle, granted that he's not mechayiv for an Issur Kollel, but be Issur Kal, That's when it's a lenient Issur. Yavo Issur Chamur Yochel al Issur Kal. However, now that he himself became Tamei, the ante was upped. Before it was a lav, now it's a Chiv Karis. So he should be Chayiv to bring a Korban Olav Yored if he eats this Tamei meat by accident. And for the Gemara, a very interesting answer. Amar Rav Ashi says, Rav Ashi. Wait, I skipped. This is chal. Umay knew what Tumas Aguf Sharei Tumas Aguf Bekaris. The ante was up because Tumas Aguf is Bekaris. Amar Rav Ashi says, Rav Ashi, Man lema lon de Tumas Aguf Chamura de Tumas Basur Chamura de Leise Tari B'Mikvah. Rav Ashi has a very interesting answer to our query, which is, it's true. I understand the argument to say that Tumas Haguf, him becoming Tamei, is more Chamor, the ante is upped, because it's now a Chiyuv Kares, whereas before it was only a Lav. However, I could also argue a very interesting argument, which is that the meat being Tamei is actually more stringent than him being Tamei. And that's because he can fix his situation. Go to the mikveh. Problem solved. So by him being Tamei, sure, it's Chayv Karis if he eats this meat, but he can also just go to the mikveh and eat it later. The meat that's Tamei, when the meat was Tamei and he was Tahor, he's stuck. There's no way that he can ever eat that meat, because you can't just chuck the meat in the mikveh. No, it's Tamei forever. You can never eat it. So in that sense, says Rav Ashi, you can argue that actually the meat being Tamei is more stringent than him being Tamei. So in terms of punishments, granted, sure, the punishment for him being Tamei is more stringent, it's Karis. But the status of him being Tamei is more lenient, because he could jump in a mikveh and become Tahor. The meat can never become Tahor. So therefore, to say that, wait, but Rabbi Yossi Aglili should say Issur chal al Issur by a Issur Kollel that is more Chamor, he does say that, sure, but this isn't that, because Tumas Aguf is not necessarily more Chamor. Unbelievable. Let me chop. I'm pretty much done with my coffee over here. I'll try to squeeze out another shluck, and then we'll do the final stretch of today's daf. But as I said, we're going to have to earn this stuff, and I would argue that we've been earning it. Okay, final push. Is this really true? The Rabbi Yossi Aglili does not hold of a plain Issur Kollel when there's no additional Chumrah. V'atani, we learn in a Brisa. Shabbos Yom Kippurim. If Yom Kippur falls out on Shabbos, Shogag v'osa miloche minayin shechayev al ze b'atzmo v'al ze b'atzmo. If Yom Kippur falls out on Shabbos and a person accidentally did melacha, he's going to be chayev 2 korban chatases. One for Shabbos, one for Yom Kippur. How do we know this? Talmud Omar, Shabbos he, Yom Kippurim hu. Divrei Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Says Rabbi Yossi Aglili, you'll be chayev a korban chatas for Shabbos and a korban chatas for Yom Kippur, because the pasuk says Shabbos he, Yom Kippur hu, giving each one their own distinction, and you'll be chayev a korban chatas for each. And Rashi explains this sugya by saying that yes, Shabbos and Yom Kippur are kind of happening at the same time, right? Sundown, Friday night, Shabbos and Yom Kippur both start. However, Rashi wants to explain this Rabbi Yossi Aglili's opinion that still the only reason why you would still be chayiv 2 separate chatases is because even if they didn't happen at exactly the same time, even if they would happen subsequently, you would still be chayiv twice, because it's an Issur Kollel. Why is it an Issur Kollel? Well, Shabbos kind of, right, is Issur Mosif. Right, whereas Yom Kippur is a Chiyuv Kares, Shabbos is Issur Misas Bezdin. So it kind of adds to that. So therefore, Shabbos has that element where it's adding in that not only you chayiv kares, but there's also Misas Bezdin. And Yom Kippur adds to Shabbos in that Shabbos you're allowed to eat. Yom Kippur adds the Issur Achila. So since each angle, whether it's Shabbos with its adding Misas Bezdin to the mix, or Yom Kippur adding Issur Achila to the mix, since you could say that even if one were to precede the other, you would still be chayav twice since they're adding to each other. So therefore, when they happen also concurrently, that comes Friday night, Shabbos and Yom Kippur kick in together, that's why you would be chayav for both, since if they would be sequentially, you would be chayav both because they're Issur Kollels. So also when they happen at the same time, that's the mechanism that allows us to say they will be chayav 2 korban chatases. So we see in this brisa that the shita of Rabbi Yossi Aglili seems to be assuming that you are chayav Issur, Halal Issur, when it comes to an Issur Kollel, which was the mechanism for us to be able to explain why if you do malacha accidentally on Yom Kippur that falls out on Shabbos, you chayav 2 korban chatases. Now, Rabbi Akiva disagrees. Einu chayav ela achas. You're only chayav 1 korban chatas. Shalach Ravin Mishum Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina. So Ravin sent from Eretz Yisrael to Babble in the name of Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina that Kachatzah Mishnah. You got that brisa correct. That is how it was taught, but it is incorrect. Ve'ipuch. You didn't do anything wrong. You quoted the brisa correctly. The brisa, however, was a corrupted brisa. It's meant to be the opposite. It's Rabbi Akiva who says Issur Kollel, that we would say Issur Halal Issur. Rabbi Yossi Aglili is the one who says that you only chayiv once, because as we saw earlier, Rabbi Yossi Aglili's shita would be that we don't say Issur Halal Issur by an Issur Kollel. Shalach Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yaakov bar Giorei Mishum de Rabbi Yochanan. The Divrei Rabbi Yossi Aglili, according to the shita of Rabbi Yossi Aglili, that we said is the opposite, right? That Rabbi Yossi Aglili says you're only going to be chayiv once. So Yom Kippur falls out on Shabbos. A person accidentally does milacha. So Rabbi Yossi Aglili says you chayiv once. Now, Rabbi Yochanan is assuming that what are you chayiv, or at least the way that we're explaining what Rabbi Yochanan is about to say, is that you're only going to be chayiv once. The Rabbi Yossi Aglili says you're only chayiv once. That's for Shabbos. That when Yom Kippur falls out on Shabbos, says Rabbi Yossi Aglili, if you accidentally do malacha, Rabbi Yossi Aglili says you're only going to be chayiv 1 korban chatas, right? Because we said, right, initially Rabbi Yossi Aglili said you'd be chayiv twice. We said flip it around. His shita is only chayiv once. And the way that we're initially going to explain what Rabbi Yochanan is about to say is that the assumption is that the 1 korban chatas that you're chayiv for is for Shabbos. The Apchon, based on the fact that we flipped around Rabbi Yossi Aglili's shita to say that he's chayiv once, it's for Shabbos. And therefore, Shogag b'Shabbos, v'hezeh b'Yom HaKippurim, if he did this melacha on Yom Kippur that fell out on Shabbos, and he forgot that it was Shabbos, but he knew it was Yom Kippur, so again, we go based on Shabbos, chayiv, you would be chayiv to be a korban chatas. But if it was the other way around, hezid b'Shabbos, he knew it was Shabbos, v'shogag b'Yom Kippur, but forgot it was Yom Kippur. So again, what's important is we go based on Shabbos, potter, since it was on purpose, he's not going to bring a korban chatas, he's chayiv kares. So it's all based on Shabbos. My timer, why are we doing it based on Shabbos? Amar Abaye explains, Shabbos kviya v'kaima. Well, because Shabbos is a constant. It's established every 7 days is Shabbos. Yom HaKippurim, Beidina dikokavile, whereas Yom Kippur is established by Bezdin. Bezdin decides when Rosh Chodesh Tishrei is, and therefore 10 days after that is, or on the 10th of Tishrei is Yom Kippur. And therefore, since Shabbos is a constant, we treat it as though it kind of came in first. And Rav is going to say, I don't understand what this means, but we treat it as if like Shabbos comes in first, and Rabbi Yossi HaGlili does not hold of Issur Kollel, and Shabbos comes in first, and therefore it's all based on Shabbos. Rava says, Sof, Tavayu Ba'adei Adodi Kos. Says Rava, I don't understand what you're saying. Shabbos comes in first. They both come in at the same time. Friday night, Shabbos and Yom Kippur kick in at the same time. Rather, says Rava, that thing with Rabbi Yochanan, when he says that according to Rabbi Yossi HaGlili, it wouldn't be entirely based on Shabbos, that if he forgot that it was Shabbos, even though he knew it was Yom Kippur, you would be chayav a korban chatas. If he knew it was Shabbos and he forgot it was Yom Kippur, there would be no korban chatas. That's because Shmoda Hava, it was a time when the non-Jewish governments were acting very, very, very inappropriately. And they said, anybody who keeps Yom Kippur this year is in big, big trouble. We don't even want to tell you what's going to happen to you. And that year, Yom Kippur was not meant to fall out on a Shabbos. It was meant to fall, let's say, on a Wednesday. I don't know, whenever, some other day of the week. And the authorities, the non-Jewish authorities, they said, we catch anybody doing Yom Kippur, you're in big, big trouble. Shabbos, for whatever reason, they didn't have a problem with, but Yom Kippur, that was a big no-no. So V'shalchu mitam, so they said, okay, Yom Kippurei da'ashata Shabsa, who this year you're gonna, celebrate, so to speak. You'll do Yom Kippur on Shabbos. That way, the authorities won't go around massacring people. But the fact of the matter is, it wasn't technically Yom Kippur. They said do Yom Kippur on Shabbos this year, so that there shouldn't be any year where there's like literally no Yom Kippur like that. That would be bad for a lot of reasons. We got to make sure that we keep the traditions going, otherwise they'll get lost. So we need to have a Yom Kippur this year. So do it on Shabbos, but it wasn't actually Yom Kippur on Shabbos. And what did they do on the actual day of Yom Kippur? It's an interesting question. But in terms of, so they said on Shabbos, treat it as though it's Yom Kippur that fell out on Shabbos. But the fact of the matter, it wasn't Yom Kippur that year. It was Shabbos that year. And that's why we said that you would only be chayiv for Shabbos. But it's not because Shabbos comes in first or something. It happens to be that particular year, it was in fact only Shabbos. It wasn't actually Yom Kippur. And also when Ravin came from Eretz Yisrael to Babble, and anybody else who came from Eretz Yisrael to Babble, Amru Rava, they explained it like Rava explained it, that what happened in that scenario where we said it's entirely based on Shabbos. If it was B'shogeg, you'd be chayiv korban chatas. If it was Mezid of Shabbos, you wouldn't be chayiv korban chatas. And we're not taking Yom Kippur into account. It's because that year there was some terrible decree from the authorities threatening anybody who keeps Yom Kippur that year. Big, big mess. So they said, okay, well, do it on Shabbos just to keep, to make sure that there is Yom Kippur that year. But you wouldn't be chayiv a korban chatas or anything for it. Chevre, that was Daf Kuf Aleph of Masechta Chulin. All right, sheesh. I knew this was going to be a big one. I knew it. It took me a long time to prepare and to review. That's just the way it goes. I knew it was going to be tough. But Chevre, thanks for hanging in there with me. The first section, right, so today we learned a new Mishnah about Gid hanasheh when it comes to a non-kosher animal. The Chacham said that there is no Gid hanasheh by a non-kosher animal. The Rabbi Yehudah says that there is. He made his argument based on Gid hanasheh already being from before Matan Torah. The Chacham disagreed with that. And the Gemara then immediately jumped into the question of, but what's Rabbi Yehudah's shita when it comes to Issur, chal, Issur? Hare, Rabbi Yehudah's shita is ein Issur, chal, Issur, as we saw by Nivlas of Tomit. But nonetheless, when it comes to Gid hanasheh, we said that he would say Issur chal al Issur, since Gid hanasheh is so stringent and that it even applies from before Matan Torah. And by eating a non-kosher animal, you would be chayav for eating a non-kosher animal as well for eating Gid hanasheh. Along the way, we saw the shita of Reb Shimon, who says that one who eats the Gid hanasheh of a non-kosher animal would be chayav nothing. That is because he says, Ein begidim b'nosein tam. Therefore, by eating the Gid hanasheh, you're not chayiv for eating a non-kosher animal. And also in terms of the Gid hanasheh itself, Alkein lo yochlu b'nei Yisrael Gid hanasheh. When the issue is, don't eat the Gid hanasheh, but you can eat the rest of the animal. A non-kosher animal, you can't eat any of it. Therefore, get hanasheh doesn't apply to non-kosher animals. So therefore, by eating the get hanasheh of a non-kosher animal, you're not chayiv for eating a non-kosher animal, nor are you chayiv for eating the get hanasheh. And then we got into this discussion about Issur Kollel, which is an interesting but complex topic, which is when you have one Issur, in our case get hanasheh, and then you have another Issur, let's say nevela, which is an Issur that includes the get hanasheh, includes all the meat of the animal. The question is, would you be chayiv additionally for eating nevela? Reb Meir said yes, we would say that Issur Chalal Issur by an Issur Kollel. We saw, however, the Chachamim in that brisa argued with him and says no. We don't say Issur Chalal Issur by an Issur Kollel, but we would say that if the Issur Kollel upped the ante, for example, if we're talking about a Korban Ola or Shora Niskal, which is an Issur Ana'ah, and then we said that was the Shita of Rabbi Yossi Aglili. We explored that based on a Mishnah in Masechta Zvachim regarding Tamei She'achol Es HaKodesh, and then we kind of further explored that with the Kippur that fell out on Shabbos. Cheveh, that was Daf Kuf Aleph, Daf 101 of Masechta Chullin. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for working with me. Have a great, great day. Cheers.